Well, Zag fans may feel like they have Ryan Nembhard's game figured out thanks to his brother Andrew, but there is still plenty to learn about the former Creighton guard, and we're going to dig into all of that and more right here on the Locked On Zags podcast.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is up? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Thrilled to be joined today by Matt St. Jean of Road to the Garden, covering all things Big East hoops. Matt joins me today to talk about a variety of different Big East topics. We're going to talk about the upcoming Gonzaga-UConn series starting at Climate Pledge Arena this upcoming season. We're also going to talk about the rumors that UConn could be joining the Big 12. Maybe Gonzaga and UConn games will end up in the same conference down the line. But before we get into any of that, we got to talk about Ryan Nembhard, the new point guard for the Gonzaga Bulldogs next season. Matt, the first question I want to ask you is really just about the surprise or the emotion, the feeling that we had when Ryan Nembhard entered the transfer portal, because I distinctly remember being in my car in the Fred Meyer parking lot, checking Twitter and being like, what? Like, I was stunned that Ryan Nembhard entered the portal. Obviously, even more surprised that he went to Gonzaga. Not shocked, mind you, that he ended up at Gonzaga because, of course, there was a strong connection there, but everybody had sort of connected him to Tommy Lloyd in Arizona. I want to know from your perspective, kind of on the Big East side of things, how surprising was it to see a player who played 34 minutes a game for a team that was really successful to enter the portal in the first place and ultimately end up in Spokane?
It was definitely shocking. I will say, I think there were some rumblings of Creighton movement in general as the offseason hit. I don't think anybody, I think a lot of people assumed, hey, it's just rumblings and it's the transfer portal era. And this is always going to happen until basically everybody on that roster has either portaled or gone to the draft, except for Baylor Shireman at this point.
Right.
So in hindsight, maybe not as shocking, but at the time it was, wow, it was Creighton can bring back everybody from a team that was almost in the national championship. And now it's a very different group. Definitely a big shock for a very talented player who in his second year took a step forward and looked like he was ready to really take on the reins as a junior for Greg McDermott.
Well, I want to talk about that step forward that he took, because looking at his numbers, you can see a pretty clear progression of he played almost the exact same number of minutes per game in his second year at Creighton as he did in his first year. Of course, he played more games his second year because they went farther in the tournament, and also he had suffered that ankle injury in his freshman season. But numbers wise, he's up in points, he was up in rebounds, he was up in assists, he was up in all field goal percentage, 3-point percentage, and free throw percentage while being down in turnovers. That is a tremendous amount of growth from year one to year two, but it wasn't huge. Like, all of those numbers changed incrementally. And it feels like that was kind of the general gist from watching the team this year, is that he just got a little bit better in every single way. And obviously he had a very talented team around him. I think you can touch on this a little bit more, but I imagine bringing in a talented player like Baylor Shireman to play kind of next to him in that backcourt, no doubt helped his ability to kind of improve in those areas. But did it just look to you like we just got a slightly better version of Ryan Nembhard? And do you expect that to continue even with a move to a different program?
Yeah, I think he looked more comfortable out there. You talk about the one number that did drop being turnovers. I think that's where you see it. And especially when you're a point guard, you go from being a freshman to a sophomore. I feel like that's the area where you really want to see improvement. As you catch up to the speed of college, then the mental mistakes start to go away. You become more efficient. And we saw that. He's still not the cleanest player when it comes to turnovers, but he passes so well that, you can kind of live with that. 4.8 assists per game last year. You can live with a couple turnovers when you're producing like that. The talent around him also certainly helped and was able to make things easier. And when you got Ryan Kalkbrenner in the paint to kind of erase misses, that makes you play with a little bit more freedom really at both ends of the floor. So I think you saw improvement. I'm really excited to see what he looks like in year 3 because I think he still does have another step he can reach.
Yeah.
For as good as he was, for every really good game, it felt like he also had a bad game mixed in there. He had some hot and cold in him, and if he can erase some of that cold, raise the floor on what he brings game in and game out, that's where you go from being, an all-conference player to a conference player of the year type of guy.
It's funny because as much as we want to maybe avoid doing too many comparisons to his brother, because I'm sure that's not what he wants and that's not necessarily always going to be accurate. One of the things that Andrew struggled with, particularly a little earlier in his career, was inconsistency, was having a few games where he was the best point guard on the floor and he was the catalyst and he led Gonzaga to a win based on getting out in transition and just being devastating in the pick and roll. And then there would be games where he kind of wasn't that guy or was a little bit more inconsistent or struggled with pressure. That was a big thing that challenged him in his career and that he really kind of found ways to eventually overcome towards the end of his final season at Gonzaga. And of course, parlayed that into a very successful rookie season with the Pacers last year. So for Ryan, it sounds like some of those things may end up cropping up a little bit. I think obviously the Big East has more athletes and more overall talent than the WCC. I'm a huge proponent of the WCC. I think it's a great basketball conference, but it's just not the Big East. It's not. And so I do think that that'll be a little bit easier for him on a night-to-night basis to maybe not have to face as much pressure from opposing teams. But Gonzaga is going to load the heck up on their non-conference schedule, as they always do, as we know they already are with Kentucky and UConn already on that schedule. But I wonder for you, just looking at Nembhard and knowing that he's probably going to be in a pretty free-flowing, high-octane, lots of possessions offense with a lot of pick and roll, like it feels like a lot of the skills that Nembhard possessed and showed at Creighton are skills that are going to be immediately translatable to what Gonzaga likes to do. Do you think that that's kind of the general gist that you're getting here, and anything that you think that might kind of continue to help him grow and succeed as a basketball player?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's really good in the pick and roll. That's an area as a ball handler where he does really well. He's good as a spot up shooter. He's a pretty good catch and shoot guy. So I think he's a point guard, but you can play him off the ball and not have to worry. And in an offense like Gonzaga's, I think that's going to be good. And hopefully you can take a little bit of pressure off of him too. I think he'll thrive in an environment like that. Transition is going to be interesting. That was one of the areas where he maybe wasn't as productive as you would think last year. He seems to process the game better when it's slower. There's a Creighton team that played very slow basketball last year, which is not what you typically expect from Greg McDermott in that offense, but they like to slow it down and play in the half court. He's good in that environment. Part of taking that next step, I think, will be taking advantage of stuff in transition, being able to play at that high tempo. And part of that for Creighton last year, that team had zero depth. I anticipate Gonzaga will probably have better depth than Creighton did, and that means you can play a little bit faster. You can take a little bit of more time off. He's played 34 minutes a game or more every season, first 2 seasons at Creighton. If you can get that number almost down a little bit and increase the quality of his chances, then I think he'll be a more efficient player with all that. So definitely room to grow for him. And I think you have some concerns with him with the defensive end just because of his size. 6 feet. I think he's listed under 170 pounds, so he's not the biggest guy out there, and he's fine on defense. But as we saw in the San Diego State game, that foul call. The reason that foul gets called and San Diego State advances is because he gets beat off the dribble and is behind the guy, and I think that's an issue he kind of had last year. So there's room around the edges for him to grow his game, but he's coming in as already a very good player who's definitely a system fit.
Well, Matt, we talked a little bit about Gonzaga's schedule next year and how it'll challenge these guys right away. One of those games that is going to be on the calendar at Climate Pledge Arena in Seattle will be against the UConn Huskies, a game that Gonzaga no doubt wants to get some revenge after getting torched in the NCAA tournament by Danny Hurley's team. We're going to talk about that game and maybe some other Big East teams that Gonzaga could, should, would, might schedule down the line. All of that coming after a word from today's sponsor, Bird Dogs. And look, let me tell you about our new shorts, Bird Dogs, because as we move into the summer and short season and better weather, especially here in the Pacific Northwest, where we're seeing a lot of sunshine these days, I got myself a couple of pairs of Bird Dogs for the very first time. And I usually don't really care about the shorts that I'm wearing. Maybe it's basketball shorts. If it is golf shorts, it's only really kind of in comfortable settings. But these Bird Dogs are fantastic. I can wear them wherever. The stretchy fabric is so comfortable. They're more comfortable than anything else that I'm wearing. And I can wear them in all sorts of environments. I can wear them out to a bar with friends. I can wear them to the golf course. I can wear them to the pool. I can wear them around the house. Wherever I want to wear them, they are comfortable and they fit and they just work perfectly for that. It's super practical. It gets really hot in here when I'm recording these podcasts, so it's really nice to have them with that liner. It makes them feel cooler and allows me to focus more on the show. And if you all want to feel the same way, then you can go to birddogs.com/lockedoncollege. And when you enter the promo code LockedOnCollege, they will throw in a free custom Bird Dogs Yeti style tumbler with every single order. Bird Dogs, a proud sponsor of the Locked On Podcast Network. Folks, I want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen every day. For you everyday listeners, we're going to continue to talk about the NBA draft processes. We're going to continue to talk about the transfer portal and players that could be targets for Gonzaga, depending what happens with Anton Watson and Malachi Smith. We're also going to have a fun interview for you on Friday to close out the week, so stick it out right here, Locked On Zags podcast, and go subscribe on YouTube if you have not done so yet. All right, Matt, we got Zags Huskies coming up this season, Climate Pledge Arena. It's going to be a very, very fun one. Again, Gonzaga probably wants a little revenge after getting beat 82-54 in the Sweet 16. I apologize every time I say that score out loud because I know it makes a lot of people listening wince, and I understand why. That was not a particularly fun game to watch for people in Spokane. But we got these two fantastic games. Again, Zags-UConn at Climate Pledge Arena this year. Next year, they're going to play at Madison Square Garden. I've gone on record before as saying that neutral site versus neutral site games are very fun as long as they are even in that way. There was a lot of controversy for the Gonzaga-Kentucky series where Gonzaga hosted at the Spokane Arena, which is not their home stadium, and the return game is at Rupp Arena for Kentucky. But this one, I think, makes a ton of sense. It's going to be a lot of high energy, a lot of crowds in both arenas. And I kind of want to just talk about how excited we are to see these two teams play each other, because I think for Gonzaga, every time they can get a marquee opponent who's willing to play them twice, it's a really fantastic win. And right now there doesn't get to be a lot more marquee opponents than getting to play UConn for the next 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, this is just two of the better programs in college basketball right now, going back and forth in two big arenas. Like this is fun. This is why we like college basketball, and not to dunk on college football, but this is something you don't get that often in college football. And yeah, it's a neutral site, but in some ways not really. Like it's an arena Gonzaga's comfortable with. Madison Square Garden is obviously a place UConn's comfortable with. You're going to get a ton of fans in both places. It's more so a home away from home for both of these schools.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's going to be entertaining. I'm very much looking forward to this. UConn has a loaded non-conference schedule for next season already. So excited to see what the new look Huskies look like, the post-championship Dan Hurley Huskies.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned the home away from home, because that's absolutely the case. And Gonzaga just came off of a 2-year deal similar to this, where you'd expect they split it. It was with Alabama, 1 game at Climate Pledge Arena, 1 game in Birmingham, and they split the series, but not in the way that you would expect. Alabama came all the way out to Seattle and beat Gonzaga. And then this year, that Alabama team that looked like the best team in the country for a while, Gonzaga went to not quite their house, but their state in Birmingham and dropped 100 on them. So perhaps we'll see something similar with this UConn series. I think it's kind of up in the air right now. Of course, the way college basketball currently is, trying to predict what's going to happen in 2024 is literally impossible, because I don't know what the rosters are going to look like. And even now, looking ahead to this upcoming season, I think Gonzaga's roster is fairly well set, depending on what happens with a few other guys. But UConn's at a little bit more of a uncertain position. We know Jordan Hawkins is not coming back. He's in the NBA draft process. He is long gone, and for good reason. He's going to be a highly selected player. We know that Joey Calcaterra is finally out of college eligibility, so he is out the door. We know Naheem Aline is out the door. I think did he go to St. John's? Is that right?
He did go to St. John's.
Another one of those Big East to Big East transfers there.
Hopped on 84 right down to Queens.
Exactly. But the big questions for UConn are what's going to happen with Adama Sanogo, who was one of the best players in that NCAA tournament, one of the best players in college basketball last year. Andre Jackson Jr. is also in the NBA draft process. I'm kind of curious your thoughts on what, as little as we know right now, but what you kind of think UConn might look like next year. It's hard to imagine they're going to take too much of a drop off, but there is a fair amount of talent off this roster.
Well, when you come into this season, it's funny, if you were trying to kind of look at the trajectory of the program, last year was supposed to be a good season for UConn,
Right.
and this upcoming season was supposed to be the year.
Mhm.
And you got more contributions from people that like you didn't expect. Like Calcaterra, I think, was better than expected. Klingon as a freshman was better than expected. Caravan as a freshman was better than expected. And because of that, obviously the team gets better, but you're also going to lose guys. It does not look like Sanogo is coming back.
Yeah.
Andre Jackson is really 50-50 at this point. I lean towards him not coming back right now from what we're seeing. Tristan Newton is also in the draft process. I don't think he is going, but we don't know for sure yet. So the reason that this next season was supposed to be kind of the year for UConn is you look at the recruiting class coming in. It ranks number 4 in the country, according to 24/7. They've got Stephon Castle coming in, who's the 10th recruit in the country. You got 3 more top 100 guys: Solomon Ball, Jalen Stewart, Jaden Ross, plus a high 3-star in Yusuf Singare. So you put it all together, and you got 5 guys coming in who, in theory, could start for you right away on any other team. And you add in Caravan and Klingon should be back. I believe Hassan Diarra is still sticking around. And we're waiting on other guys to see exactly what this is going to look like. But it should be a very good team. What we're looking at now for this UConn-Gonzaga game is this is going to be a huge road test for a young group with very, very high expectations. And whether it should be or not, for UConn fans, it's going to feel like a must-win coming in, or at least if this game isn't competitive, I think you're going to be upset because this is the year where everything is supposed to come together. And we're going to learn a lot about what the Huskies are when these teams meet, and I assume that's also going to be true in 2024 at Madison Square Garden.
Unquestionably, I think it'll be, and it's a great early test for Gonzaga as well. They're not going to be as young as this UConn team. They have 3 transfers coming in who are all expected to play big minutes. Of course, Nembhard, who we just spoke about, Graham Ike out of Wyoming, Steele Venters from Eastern Washington. Got some returnees if Anton Watson comes back, which is generally what we continue to expect here on the show until we hear otherwise. That's obviously a nice veteran returner for them as well. So it kind of feels like it's potentially shaking out to be a young roster in UConn versus a more veteran team at Gonzaga. But of course, this young UConn roster is going to be built on the backs of a few guys who were there for a national championship team last year. So it's going to be an extremely fun game. I mentioned the Gonzaga-Alabama series because there are a lot of similarities, but also because as much as it sucked to lose for Gonzaga at Climate Pledge Arena against Alabama, that was an extremely fun pair of games. And I think that this is going to set up to be really similar. And I think we've seen Gonzaga Big East home and home or neutral site series in the past. And I think they almost always turn out well. And I'm curious your thoughts on what some future ones could potentially look like here, because we've seen Gonzaga play Creighton. We've seen them play Butler. That was admittedly a long time ago. And now, of course, they're going to play UConn. And knowing what, as much knowledge as you have about the Big East, I'm curious what other potential matchups you think Mark Few should get on the phone and try to create, or the Big East coaches should try to call him in and see if we could get some of those matchups together, because I think there's some potentially really, really fun ones that could come together if they wanted to.
Well, I've got a couple here that I put together and named. I think the first one we got, it's easy. It's the Ryan Nembhard Bowl.
Yeah, exactly.
Creighton Gonzaga. It makes sense from a travel perspective. I think they're the closest team to Gonzaga out there. 2 very good coaches, 2 teams, 2 programs that are good year in, year out. 2 schools that are very, basketball heavy. And if Gonzaga were to ever join the Big East, Creighton's that's the natural rival just when it comes to distance there. So that's one I would love to see with those fan bases too. And I think that's one where you could do a true home and home and you wouldn't need any neutral site involved. The next one I'm going with is going to be there's a little bit of a stretch, but the Tommy Lloyd Bowl between Xavier and Gonzaga, because of the connection through Sean Miller to Arizona there. We've seen Sean Miller's teams known for their defense. All of a sudden, you get this huge offensive output last year. And I would love to see what Sean Miller's ideal lineup at Xavier looks like against what Mark Few does at Gonzaga. I think that's a ton of fun. And again, two great environments. And then my third one that I named here, the Battle of the Washingtons, Gonzaga against Georgetown.
Yeah.
If Ed Cooley can get Georgetown up and going, this is one in 3, 4 years, 5 years, that could all of a sudden be a very, very appealing matchup. And I think I'd love to see that. I mean, that would just could be incredibly entertaining. Then a couple other ones. You're looking at Providence and Villanova right now, depending on what those coaching situations turn out to be. Obviously, Villanova is a huge brand. Providence doing pretty well so far here with Kim English, all things considered, with the situation there. And you got a talent like Bryce Hopkins. If they can keep that going, that matchup gets intriguing. And obviously, I don't think you can forget Marquette and Gonzaga. Shaka Smart against Mark Few. There's no like catchy narrative here or anything. It's just two really good coaches going against each other.
Yeah, the Shaka Smart versus Mark Few one is really fun, and you're right. There's not a huge narrative there, but just those two coaches in general, I think would create such a fun and unique basketball environment. And Gonzaga and Sean Miller have had plenty of history in the past there, so I think a fun matchup there. That they're old rivalry games at Arizona, which have not been added back because Gonzaga and Tommy Lloyd, they haven't played each other yet. Hopefully they bring that back into the fold. But if we can't play Arizona, then let's kind of fill that gap by playing Xavier. They played them last year in the Phil Knight Invitational, and that was a really fun game.
That was a great game. And that was kind of
great game.
That was the game that put Xavier kind of on the map too.
Yeah,
even though they lost, it was all right. They can play with the big boys.
They only lost because Julian Strother finally hit a couple threes at the end of the game, which sort of set him up for a season of hitting clutch shots at the end of games.
And I think it also showed the issue with Xavier being the lack of defense.
Exactly.
Which ended up biting them down the stretch as well.
Yeah, it did. Well, Gonzaga versus UConn could become a more regular thing because Big 12 Commissioner Brett Yormark is hell-bent on creating an elite basketball super conference. We're going to discuss what that might mean for the Big East and what it might mean for UConn, who has had preliminary conversations with the Big 12 already. We'll discuss that all coming up right after this. All right, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still locked on Zags, still joined here by Matt St. Jean of Road to the Garden, still talking a lot of different Big East topics here on Locked on Zags. And I want to talk a little bit about conference realignment, because conference realignment is never really a topic that has died. Gonzaga has been in the news for conference realignment topics for a very long time now, dating back to 2018 when they were voted unanimously to join the Mountain West, but ultimately decided not to do so after getting some concessions from the WCC. Now, the former WCC commissioner, Gloria Nevarez, she made the same jump over to the Mountain West, and that's where she's working now. Gonzaga to the Big East has been something that has been discussed a lot, but lately, of course, the rumors surround the Big 12, where we know that conversations have happened with the commissioner, Brett Yormark, and with the other ADs there, but we haven't heard any numbers. We haven't heard any financials, which is obviously a huge part of a major conference like the Big 12 attempting to add a program like Gonzaga that does not have a football team and what that would look like. But the latest that we've heard is that the Big 12 is also looking at UConn, and it's hard to blame them for wanting to do that if they do want to expand into as many different time zones as possible, and they want to kind of have an east to west conference, and they want to be basketball focused. UConn's a pretty darn good place to continue to have that conversation. UConn also a conference that has left the Big East relatively recently and then rejoined the Big East because they were not particularly happy with their decision to join the American Conference, in part because they didn't like having to travel all the way to South Florida, which if they joined the Big 12, they would also have to do. Matt, I'm curious your initial thoughts as we're just learning some of the early parts of this conversation. Your initial thoughts on maybe what this would mean for UConn, and if you really think how realistic you think this might be for them to consider a jump to the Big 12 here.
I think it's incredibly realistic. Athletic director Dave Benedict, if you follow him on Twitter, first of all, he's very, very active on there and not really shy about expressing his opinions, but he's done nothing to shut down rumors of stuff like this for the past year, really even since UConn rejoined the Big East. There's kind of always been an undercurrent of, well, we can leave again if we want to. Yeah. I know there's a pretty big buyout attached at the moment.
Sure.
But also, depending on the size of that buyout might be covered by 1 year in the Big 12 with the new
Right.
media deal there. Media deal that kicks in 2025 averages over $30 million per school per year. That's the number that's out there publicly. For contrast, the Big East current deal, which expires at the end of the 2024-25 season, gets you, I don't know, $3 or $4 million per year per school. So that's, a pretty significant increase if
Yeah.
we're able to get it. We will see what the Big East media deal would look like, but UConn has actually done pretty well as a football team the last year or two, bringing in Jim Mora.
Yeah.
The fact that they're getting a little bit of revenue there, I feel like they think they can invest, and being in the Big 12 will give them the money they need to compete. And just, more money is kind of the name of the game here, especially you get into the political budgetary stuff in Connecticut because it's a state school and there are certain requirements they have to meet and all that stuff. It becomes about the money. I don't think the fans want this. I think the fans would rather stay in the Big East. That's where the rivalries are. But from a monetary perspective, I think the budgetary stuff works out. And for the Big 12, you add the New York media market essentially with UConn. You're close enough that you're going to get that. And I would be very unfortunate for the Big East, especially if this were to happen right before a new media deal would have to be negotiated to lose a team that just won the national championship and has been one of your biggest draws for the past 24 months.
Yeah, I like that you made the point about the fans, because what the fans want isn't always going to be what determines the decisions. I mean, a summary of the very good analysis you just gave us would be 2 words: money talks. Like, that's effectively what this is that they didn't like traveling and being outside of the Big East when they were in the American, which makes sense because it probably wasn't any more lucrative. Whereas going to the Big 12, maybe you don't like the travel, maybe you don't like the lack of rivalries, maybe you don't like that your football team is probably going to struggle in the Big 12 against some of the opponents they're going to play there. But if you're making 4 times or 6 times or 8 times as much money, it's really hard to ignore that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they should do this. That doesn't mean that you should ignore what the fans want, because I think you're absolutely right that fans are not going to necessarily want this, but I can understand why it would come to that. And I think the last question I kind of want to touch on here is about the Big East in general, because the viability of the Big East has been in question for such a long time. ESPN's thrown out multiple documentaries about it, and the Big East has continued to survive. And sure, it took a big hit, about a decade ago, but their last year and the year before that was obvious success on the basketball court. They're really successful in that regard. But as we see these really intense, shocking moves of USC, UCLA going across the country to join the Big Ten, and some of the other conversations that are happening around Gonzaga and other programs in the Big 12, like, how much fear is there about the viability of the Big East right now and their kind of need? And of course, the ACC could be gone in a few weeks. I don't know that that's actually going
by the time this is released. Yeah,
right. Exactly. Who knows? Like, there's so much changing and happening all the time. But for the Big East as a conference that is not predicated on football, like, there has to be some concern that some of these bigger programs like UConn, if they're really looking at these options and are going to get paid more to do them, like, how scary is that for Big East fans?
Honestly, I don't think it's scary at all at this point. And I think that's the nice thing being in this position compared to where the conference was a decade ago.
Yeah.
There's only one viable football asset in the conference, and it's UConn.
Right.
If UConn walks, UConn walks. This conference existed without UConn and did very well for a stretch there. You have an AP Coach of the Year in Shaka Smart. You have the Naismith Coach of the Year from the coach before, or from the year before, in Ed Cooley.
Right.
You got coaching talent. You got some programs that are very legitimate. I think you'd have a very good group of teams that you still feel good about. You're not going to be crazy rolling in money, but I also don't think any of your teams are really going to get poached away by any other conferences. Nobody's after that Villanova football money right now. I can tell you that much. So I think you feel pretty good. You feel solid. And you're also in a position where you can look to add a school if you would like. But if you go back from 11 teams to 10 teams, just going back to the way things were before UConn came in, which worked very, very well. I don't think anybody had an issue with that. And you could still look to add. I mean, if you're looking to add schools, I think Gonzaga would still be number 1 on the list. Then, especially if you lose a brand like UConn, that's where you say, all right, maybe the travel is worth this with a media deal coming up. Add Gonzaga and St. Mary's, maybe. I think Dayton is a school that you would think about being in the area, depending on how successful they are with Anthony Grant. A VCU or St. Louis or other schools that come to mind. but I also think these are all if the shoe fits kind of deals. If the deal doesn't work, then you just go back to 10 teams and you live with it, and you also take a nice little buyout that you get from UConn leaving. They're going to have to spend quite a bit of money on that, and we'll see what the Fox deal looks like, but the most watched broadcast in college basketball last season was a national Fox Big East game between Creighton and DePaul.
Right.
Now, many have said that that's because it was immediately after an NFL game, but I choose to think that many people want to watch DePaul basketball, and that's going to mean great things for the conference going forward. But no, in all seriousness, I mean, they're trying to take this on as we're going to have Christmas. We're going to have a Big East game on Christmas every year, having that holiday thing. You're going to get a ton of viewers, and that does well. You negotiate that into future things. You're going to make money. You're going to have the price go up, and you're feeling pretty good about it.
Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to bring your expertise about the Big East onto the show, your expertise about Ryan Nembhard as well. It's an exciting time for Gonzaga to have him in the fold, to get that game against UConn coming up this season. I'm looking forward to our next conversation here, either on Locked On Zags or on Locked On College Basketball. Folks, if you want to subscribe, make sure you do so on YouTube for Locked On Zags or Locked On College Basketball. You can find the shows wherever you get podcasts. We got more fantastic stuff coming your way to close out the week, and as we get closer and closer to June and the NBA draft coming up as well. Thank you all for listening, and as always, go Zags.